Hey guys, we are back talking about Hell's Kitchen, and today we'll be doing a chef ranking for season 4. And this is another interesting season, as it's obviously the first season with the expanded cast, where obviously we have 15 players on the season. And even within that, there are some pretty interesting placements, definitely some interesting players to get into, but we'll get to them more in a moment. But there are 15 players to talk about, and let's not waste any more time, let's get right into the video. So starting off at number 15, the player I believe played the worst on Hell's Kitchen Season 4 is a bit of a surprise. I was expecting someone else to be in the spawn spot. However, after thinking about it, I did decide to go with Sharon, the second boot of the season. And I think the main reason I have Sharon at the bottom is she is someone who Ramsey has so little faith in that he ends up eliminating her at the first opportunity without her not even being nominated, which I think really speaks to her lack of potential within the game. But even beyond that, she does almost nothing right. Where in episode 1, she has a pretty bad signature dish, but even beyond that, she has 2 pretty terrible services. Where service 1, she ends up getting kicked off her station, where she was on the appetizers due to her messing up risotto at a risotto. And service 2 is also pretty bad, where she ends up storing raw meat next to cooked meat, which obviously leaves a bad impression. And I feel like with her being eliminated, despite her not being nominated, the fact that she pushed Ramsey that much to bend the rules, I think speaks to how bad she was as a chef. And I feel like that was enough to have her at the bottom at number 15. Now moving on to number 14, and we have a chef who was not eliminated at the first opportunity, but there's a serious argument for it. And we have Jason Underwood, the third boot of the season. And obviously Jason does survive an elimination. In fact, he's not even nominated at the first elimination he's eligible for. But even then, I feel like he probably would have been eliminated had he been nominated at that first elimination, as there is a serious argument for this service being pretty bad, where for one, he volunteers to be the captain, but then he's not even in the kitchen when the service starts, which is pretty insane. But then even after he enters the kitchen, he ends up having a pretty bad service where he's on appetizers and he just screws up risotto after risotto to the point where Ramsey has him sit down and eat one of his risottos, which is pretty funny. But again, he does at least survive that first round. Service 2 also isn't great, where he ends up putting up raw fish, and he also has trouble communicating with the rest of his team, which obviously holds up the kitchen, but they win that service, so whatever. And then we get to his boot round, where he actually does pretty well in the challenge, scoring 6 points for his team, but then he follows it up with another really bad service where Ramsey quizzes him about the menu, only for him to fail 2 times, and along the way he even wants to give up, which is a terrible look there. And while he's eventually able to push through it, I feel like by that point his fate was largely sealed, and I feel like it was made even worse by his terrible service there, where he ends up screwing up on desserts of all things. So I feel like that just led to his elimination, largely due to him wanting to give up. So I feel like in a lot of ways, Jason is a pretty actively bad chef. The reason he's not at the bottom is he does at least survive an elimination, and plus we do at least see him making a couple of good dishes along the way, so at least there's that, but everything else about his game is pretty terrible, so because of that he is here at number 14. Now moving on to number 13, and we are finally moving on to the first boot of the season, and here we have Dominic. And again, I'm not saying Dominic is that good of a chef either. He obviously has a not great service 1 where he ends up wasting scallops, but I feel like that's pretty much the only mistake that he makes during his run. Whereas I feel like Jason made more mistakes than him, to where Jason easily could have gone home had he been nominated, but due to Dominic going up instead, he kind of just goes out because of that. So I feel like to that end, when we are comparing Dominic to other first boots, I feel like he's not the worst in the world. Then also his signature dish is certainly not the worst one that was there, but I feel like he was largely taken out due to him being kind of a boring character and him also not having much potential. So I feel like that was enough to have him at least above Jason, but beyond that, there's not too much to praise. He's here at number 13. Now moving on to number 12, and we have the next boot on the board, and that is Craig. And Craig is another pretty mediocre chef, not too much to praise here. Now his service 1 is actually kind of fine, where while he doesn't stand out in any way, he doesn't make any mistakes, so there's that at least. Then we get to service 2, where he's obviously assigned to being a system maitre d', but even then he kind of flubs that, where he ends up hitting a customer in the head with a chair. Obviously that's a pretty bad look, but again, they win that service, so whatever. And it's really not until service 3 that we really start to see him flounder, where for one, he ends up only getting 2 points in the challenge. That's a bad look. But then we see his team kind of turn against him due to this bad performance, where from that point on, like, they kind of see him as this nuisance. Where in service 3, he has a pretty bad service there. Obviously, he screws up on appetizers. That's not a great look. And then in episode 4, he once again costs his team the challenge, which also annoys them. And even beyond that, he ends up, once again, having a bad service. He puts out a raw dish. That's not great. And we even see him getting pretty upset after the service, where he feels like he doesn't need to campaign, which is a bad look. But then obviously this leads to him being taken out for being the weakest on his team. So all in all, it's another pretty bad game. And I did consider putting him lower on the list, even below Dominic. But the reason I didn't is at least his first service was okay. And plus, he does survive 2 eliminations without even being nominated. So I feel like that was at least worth noting. But at the end of the day, it's still a pretty mediocre run, which is why he's here at number 12. Now moving on to number 11, and I very much debated this one. I wasn't sure what to do with this person, but after thinking about it, I think this person played a really terrible game, despite them making it all the way to Black Jackets. But number 11, we do have Matt. And again, Matt made it to Black Jackets, which is definitely more than plenty of other players that we'll be talking about more soon. But if we look at the path there, it's just really terrible, where right at the bat he has a notoriously bad signature dish, so much so that Ramsay throws up after eating it, so that's obviously pretty bad. I will say though that his first 3 services aren't that bad, where yes, he does have a fire breaking out in service 2, and in service 3 he is called out for not communicating with Luraz, but really his beginning to the game is just kind of unremarkable. But obviously service 4 is when his game really starts to get highlighted, where he's on the meat station and he makes a bevy of mistakes there. We have a customer sending back raw chicken, which is a bad look. We also have Ramsay calling him a donkey at the service, which is pretty funny. And he's eventually nominated for putting up raw chicken. And he's largely just spared due to Craig being a bigger target at that point. Service 5 also isn't great, where he ends up screwing up on appetizers. We see Bobby having to take over a station. And he probably would have been nominated again had they lost that service, as Bobby and Petrozo wanted to target him for him being the weakest link. But they end up winning that service. So whatever. And then we get to service 6, which is obviously terrible as well, where at that point he is the outcast on the blue team. And he follows it up with another terrible service where he struggles on the fish station. He has dishes sent back to the kitchen. He serves up raw fish, which is a bad look. We have Bobby once again taking over his station. And he probably would have gone home at this service under most circumstances, where he's nominated once again. And he obviously tells Ramsay that he would be better off on the red team. And for some reason, Ramsay decides to give him another chance, which is pretty insane when you think about it. And obviously he is swapped over to the red team. And to his credit, he actually does pretty well in the first episode. He is on the red team, where obviously he has his best service of the season, which is pretty good. And he also does pretty well on the blind taste test, going 4 for 4. So he actually does pretty well initially on that group. But then he falls right back to earth in service 8, where while he does injure himself during the challenge cutting his finger, he follows it up with a pretty bad service where he has raw relentins again. He struggles on the meat station. His team even gets kicked out of the kitchen, which is bad. And he's obviously nominated yet again. And while he does survive yet again, we even see Ramsay telling him that he's on borrowed time. Service 9 is also pretty bad, where he starts off on appetizers, but gets kicked off that station. He then goes to garnishes and is kicked off that station as well. And along the way, he also annoys Ramsay again, where he gets called out for a bad service. And then we get to the Black Jackets, where I feel like he almost immediately proves why he doesn't belong there, where he has another really terrible service, screwing up dish after dish. And he further annoys Ramsay, where he even tells him after the service that he's unsure whether he wants to continue. And obviously it was pretty much a death sentence for him. He's taken out at the first round of the Black Jackets. Again, it is a pretty abysmal game, despite the fact that he made it to Black Jackets. And yes, while there are a few highlights, such as in episode 7, I feel like everything else about this game is pretty bad, where he really doesn't have a single good service across the season, and along the way he's nominated 3 times before he's eventually evicted, and there were plenty of opportunities for him to be taken out in other services had his team lost those services. So I feel like all in all, it's a pretty bad game, and because of that, he is here at number 11. Now moving on to number 10, and we have the earliest boot left on the board to talk about, and that person is Vanessa. And Vanessa is kind of a tough game to assess as she ended up having to leave the game due to an injury. Though if we are looking at her game before that, it's just kind of okay. Or right off the bat, she stands out for having the best signature dish, which is a pro, and she's even named the captain of her team for her having the best signature dish, but then immediately follows it up with a pretty mediocre service where she doesn't really live up to that leadership role, and we even see Ramsey stripping her of that captain role, giving it to Rosanne instead. But outside of that, she doesn't really make too many mistakes, and I feel like she was just kind of put on the spot for her good signature dish. Service 2 is just kind of fine, but then Service 3, she actually does pretty well in the challenge, going 8 for 8 on the challenge, but then follows it up with a pretty bad service where she's on the meat station. She ends up putting up raw steak, and she also gets super emotional during the service to where she wants to give up. And while she is nominated at the elimination, she actually ends up staying, so whatever. Then we get the service 4, which is actually pretty good for the most part until she ends up burning her hand, which requires her to go to the hospital. And obviously that leads to her in episode 5 having to pull herself from the game. It's not the worst run in the world, and I did consider putting her a little bit higher because of it. But at the end of the day, she did want to give up in Service 3, and obviously she's only there for the first 4 episodes. So for that reason, I did decide to leave her here at number 10. Now moving on to number 9, and I also debated this person as I feel like this person also had a somewhat mediocre run, but to be fair, they at least had a solid beginning to their game, and that is Rosanne. And I feel like Rosanne is kind of similar to people like Rachel from season 2, this player that had a good enough start to her game, but kind of deteriorated as the season went on. Right out the bat, she actually has a pretty good signature dish, and even beyond that, she has a good service 1, where Ramsey even names her the captain after stripping that role from Vanessa. So again, that's pretty good. Service 2 isn't great, where she's the assistant maitre d', and she has this pretty notorious moment of telling Ramsey that she's been withholding orders as she didn't want to overwhelm the kitchen, which is pretty funny. And even in Service 3, while she actually does pretty well at the challenge, she follows it up with a pretty mediocre service where she kind of struggles on the meat station, but is able to scrape through that. And while she does okay in Service 4, I feel like from Service 5 on, she does pretty poorly at every service afterwards. Where in Service 5, she's on the garner station, and she just messes up dish after dish to the point where Jen has to jump into her station to help her out. And afterwards, she somehow avoids nomination, even though there was a very serious argument for her to be nominated there. And then we get to Service 6, where she is on the meat station, and she also screws up dish after dish. And at that point, we do see Ramsey nominate her, only to give her a second chance, only for her to once again have another bad service in episode 7, and she kind of gets saved by her team winning the service, where had they not, she easily goes up and is probably eliminated at that point. And then we get to her boot round in Service 8, where it's the same story. She once again has another bad service, she runs out of supplies, which is a really bad look, and she's eventually taken out there. So again, I feel like it's a really rocky season for Rosanne, where while she has a decent first half, I feel like she really falls off in the second half, and she follows it up by bad service after bad service. And you do have to give her some credit for avoiding nomination in Service 5, but at the same time, you also have Service 7, where she probably should have gone up, only for her team to win the service. And even beyond that, there's not too much to praise about her back half of her game, which is why she's here at number 9. Now moving on to number 8, and we have a chef kind of similar to Rosanne in that they had a decent first half, but kind of falls off by the end of it, and that person is Ben. And Ben is obviously one of the bigger characters across the season, and he's probably one of the more out in front people on the blue team, where early on he has a pretty solid start, doing well in the first 2 services, and we even see him going 8 for 8 in the challenge in episode 3, but his service 3 is pretty questionable, where he's obviously on the fish station, and he has a lot of trouble with the salmon, even at one point putting up raw salmon, which is a bad look. Though again, he's able to avoid nomination there. We then get to episode 4, where he is named the strongest chef on the blue team. And while he doesn't have the worst service in the world, definitely not as bad as his service 3, we still see him getting nominated by Gordon due to him being disappointed in his leadership, but he's able to scrape through that. Service 5 is kind of whatever, but then we get to Service 6, where at that point the show focuses a lot on Ben's rivalry with Matt, who he sees as the weakest link on the blue team, though at the same time we have Matt accusing Ben of hiding behind Bobby due to their alliance, And obviously, this comes to a head in the following episode where Matt is swapped to the red team. And then obviously, Service 7 is a pretty big disaster for Ben, where at that point he admits to Ramsey he's not used to his system. He obviously has a very hard time on the meat station where he runs out of lamb and he screws up some orders. And this culminates in Ben being taken out as a way of vindicating Matt. And I feel like the way the show presents Ben's downfall makes it hard to assess his overall performance here. Where on one hand, I do think he was a mostly competent chef. I'm not necessarily of the mind that Ben was this complete lackey that was just relying on Bobby the whole time, though I will also say that his relationship with Bobby helped. I do think Ben was a decent chef and he had his share of good services, but again, the back half is where we saw a lot more of his flaws. And I feel like with Ramsey raising the expectations for him for being a leader on the blue team, I think that kind of just led Ben to crumble and to become overconfident. And obviously, that's pretty bad. I think the fact that he is eventually taken out in the first round after Matt got swapped over to the red team is a pretty bad look. And in general, I see Ben as one of the more inconsistent performers because of that. But I also feel like Ben had more potential across the season than a lot of the other players we already talked about, where I feel like Ben had more potential moving forward compared to Matt. And I feel like he had more potential compared to Rosanne, who was also seen as a leader figure at least at one point. So I figured that was enough to at least have Ben above those other people, but realistically I can't have him too much higher, so he's here at number 8. Now moving on to number 7, and we have the earliest boot left on the board to talk about, and that person is Shaina. And obviously Shaina does pretty poorly, she only gets 10th place, and I feel like with her being one of the more under-edited chefs across the season, it makes it really hard to assess her performance here. Where I feel like compared to a lot of the other chefs that made it to at least this point in the season, she isn't shown making nearly as many mistakes as other people. Where yes, you can point out some things like in Service 4, a fire breaks out in her station. Yes, in Service 5, she screws up a Wellington. And in Service 6, her boot round, she is put up and eliminated due to her being too slow around the kitchen. But realistically, if we are taking that out, she doesn't really make that many major mistakes during the season. And while she isn't shown doing anything exceptionally well either, I feel like the fact that we have other players that made it further than her, that have made more mistakes than her, and yet made it further, I feel like that's enough to at least have Shaina above them. Now, at the end of the day, I don't think she had too much potential moving forward in the game. I don't really see her as this robbed goddess, where I feel like Ramsey mostly wrote her off early on and was just looking for any excuse he could find to eliminate her. But I still feel like compared to the other players, she didn't really make as many mistakes as those other players, and I feel like she was probably eliminated too early at the end of the day. So I feel like for those reasons, I have her here at number 7. Now moving on to number 6, and we have the highest ranked pre-Black Jacket left to talk about, and that person is Lou Ross. And I feel like Lou Ross probably should have made Black Jackets over Matt, to be honest, as I feel like he had a more consistent performance during the season compared to Matt, where I feel like for the first 4 services, he's actually playing pretty well. He even wins a best of the worst in episode 1, which is pretty good. And it's really not until episode 5 that we start to see him making more mistakes. But obviously, Service 5 is pretty bad, where for one, he ends up causing his team to challenge early on, which ends up annoying his team. But then beyond that, he has a pretty bad service that ends up getting nominated for him being the worst, only for him to be saved by a nominal elimination due to Vanessa's quit. And while I think he's able to recover at certain points after that, I feel like he's never able to get back to that level of consistency, where in Service 7, he ends up going over 3 on the blind taste test, and then even moving forward, he has a pretty questionable service that ends up getting him nominated by Ben and Bobby, though he's able to scrape through that. Then we get to Service 8, where he has a pretty decent service, where he's able to impress the critics there, but then he falls right back down in Service 9, his eventual boot round, where he does really terribly at the meat station, to the point where we see customers sending back dish after dish, which is a really bad look there, and obviously that does lead to him being taken out there. So in a lot of ways, he is kind of similar to these other chefs that have a strong start but kind of fall off thereafter, though I will say that even in the back half when Lou Ross was struggling, I feel like he impressed me more in his back half compared to people like a Ben or a Rosanne. I feel like he was able to recover at points during his second half, but it's obviously not enough to avoid his elimination. So again, I am somewhat impressed by Lou Ross's game, but obviously he ended up being cut before the Black Jackets, which is why he's here at number 6. Now moving on to number 5, and we are now at the final 5, and it's just a matter of ordering them. And straight up, I had a lot of difficulty ranking these people, as I feel like the placements don't really speak to how I feel like these people perform necessarily. And at number 5, I did decide to go with Jen. And obviously, Jen ended up being 4th place during the season. And I feel like she's very close with someone we'll be talking about more soon. But I feel like Jen's game has bigger bumps along the way. Where right off the bat, she has a pretty decent service one. Where yes, while we do see her making a mistake on the eggs, I feel like we do see her do pretty well across other aspects, such as taking over for the apps after Sharon keeps screwing that up, and we also see her doing pretty well there. Service 2 is a bit rocky, where she obviously is nominated by Corey due to Corey not really liking her, despite the fact that her service there isn't even that bad, but she's able to scrape through that. Service 3 is pretty good, and by Service 4, she's even named the strongest chef on the red team, which is all pretty good. And I feel like even beyond that, she has a pretty strong service where she ends up winning best of the best. So again, all that's pretty good. And while she continues to perform well across services, I also feel like this is the point where we start to see more cracks in her relationship with Chef Ramsay, where in episode 5, she wants to target Christina, which by itself kind of annoys Ramsay as he feels like she's threatened by her. But then moving forward at the nomination ceremony, she ends up getting this really bad response to Ramsay, where she claims that by putting up Christina, she's deciding her own fate in the game, which also really annoys Ramsay. So I feel like that's not particularly great. We then get to Service 7, where Ramsay is once again being annoyed by her performance at the service, where he even calls her cocky at one point. And yes, while she doesn't do great at that service, I feel like this further highlights her relationship with Ramsay not being as strong as what it probably should be. And I think we also see this with her relationship with her fellow teammates, where the red team just doesn't seem to like her that much. And we see that play out where in episode 8, she volunteers to join the blue team, and the red team is pretty happy that she's gone now. And the blue team doesn't seem to like her either, where yes, she does well at the service, helping them win that service, but we also see before this, her getting really upset at Lou Ross after he cost them the challenge, which really rubs a lot of people on that team the wrong way. And we see her having a bit of a downfall in the following episode, where in that case, she's the reason her team loses the challenge, and she ends up getting really indignant during the punishment, which makes her come off as really hypocritical. And plus, she is really domineering in coming up with a menu for that service. And we even see her coming up with a pretty bad menu that Ramsay doesn't seem to like. And she's even nominated at the next elimination, largely because of how domineering and annoying she comes off to the blue team. But obviously she's able to scrape through that. And then we get the Black Jackets, where while she does win that initial challenge, she follows it up with a really inconsistent service, where while she does okay initially on the starters, we then see her going over to garnishes after Corey has to leave, and she does really terribly at it, where she ends up burning rice and she ends up getting kicked out of the service. That's not a particularly good look. She has another really bad service at the final 5, where she ends up messing up dish after dish, and she ends up getting nominated largely due to her being disliked by the others, where she's seen as this person bringing down the team, but she's able to scrape through that. And then we get to her boot round at the final 4, where at that point she has another pretty bad service where Ramsay really cuts into her once again, and obviously she is taken out at that point. So in a lot of ways, I am kind of conflicted on Jen, as admittedly I think she is a pretty solid chef on paper. I feel like she has plenty of good services, but at the same time, I feel like she was really dragged down by people just not liking her that much. And while you can call some of that out for being unfair, I feel like it did lead to her being nominated at various points. It also led to her team just not working well with her during services. And I think most importantly, the fact that she occasionally got on Ramsay's nerves too is what really sunk her chances of winning. Where I feel like through that, it made it hard for her to get too much further past the final 4. So I did kind of debate between Jen and the next person. However, I feel like the next person has fewer flaws than Jen, even though they're still a pretty flawed player on their own, which is why they're here at number 5. Now moving on to number 4, and we have the other person I was referring to, and that person is Bobby. And again, this was a debate for me over whether Bobby or Jen were better, where I feel like there are some similarities you can point out with their games, Now, admittedly, Bobby has a worse start to his season compared to Jen, where obviously he has a pretty notable bad service where he volunteers to be the captain, only for him to completely fail at doing well at the first service, to the point where Ramsey strips him of that role, and he even gets nominated at that first service, so that's not great. Service 2 also isn't great, where he ends up making mistakes and he ends up getting into arguments with Jason, that's not ideal. So again, it is a pretty rocky start to his game, but I do think he picks it up afterwards, where he does pretty well the next couple services, even getting a best of the worst after service 4, and it's also during the stretch that we really start to see him emerge as a leader figure on the blue team. Now, there are definitely bumps along the way, like you have the whole Matt situation where obviously he's targeted due to his alliance with Ben, and he ends up losing Ben after Matt switches over to the red team. That's not particularly great. And there are a couple services where he makes some mistakes, like in service 7, he obviously has a lot of trouble communicating there. But again, for the most part, it's a mostly solid run for him. And it's really not until the Black Jackets that we really see him having another bad service. And I think that's definitely one of the bigger issues with Bobby's run, is that from the Black Jackets on, he kind of just underperforms, where at the final 5, he ends up doing pretty poorly at the fish station. He ends up cooking salmon and scallops in the same pan, which is a big annoyance to Ramsey. And then we get to his boot round at the final 4, where he has a really terrible service on the meat station, messing up dish after dish, and he's eventually taken out over Jen, despite the fact that Jen arguably had a worse service at that point compared to him. And we even see Christina thinking that Jen should have gone home there, but obviously Ramsey thinks otherwise. So again, it's a game in which he has a really rocky start and he has a really rocky end. But I feel like the middle stretch is pretty strong for the most part, where he is a leader for a lot of the season, and I feel like he is a bit more consistent in his run compared to Jen. And I also feel like Bobby had better relationships with his other chefs and with Ramsey compared to Jen, where yes, he did rub some people the wrong way with his leadership, particularly with Matt, but we literally saw Jen annoying every single person on her cast and annoying Ramsey as well. Which, yes, you could point out for being unfair, that still was a key aspect to her run. Whereas Bobby was able to be more of a leader for his team and was someone who was taken more seriously during his season compared to Jen. So I feel like those aspects were enough to have him above Jen in my eyes, which is why he's here at number 4. Now moving on to number 3, and we probably have the toughest placement left, as I did not know what to do with this person. I feel like this person has some good aspects to their game, but I feel like it's a pretty rocky one for the most part. But we actually have the winner of the season, and here we have Christina. And again, I know Christina ended up winning the season, and clearly Ramsey saw something within her to give her that win. But I feel like based off her performance, I feel like it's an incredibly rocky performance. And I feel like if I were Ramsey, I probably would not have given her the win. But what do I know? Right at the bat, she has a pretty bad signature dish. And I know most of the cast had a bad signature dish as well, but again, worth pointing out. In terms of her services, I feel like a lot of her early game is pretty unremarkable, though obviously there's a pretty notable moment in service 2 where she ends up getting nominated by Corey for strategic reasons, and while Ramsey ends up overruling those nominations, it's still not great that she was on Corey's radar to begin with. And while she follows it up by winning Best of the Worst in Service 3, we get to Service 5 where she ends up doing really terribly on the dessert station, which is normally a station that people don't have issues with, but the fact that she struggled with it is definitely worth pointing out, and she ends up getting nominated once again for this bad service, only for it to be cancelled by the fact that Vanessa had to leave the game. And while I don't think she would have gone home had this been a normal round, it's still not great that she had a bad service here. Her next couple services are fine, but then we get to service 8 where she ends up doing really poorly once again, and we see her getting nominated once again, this time by Ramsey, though she's able to scrape through that. And while she bounces back in service 9 with a pretty good service, we then get to service 10, which is also really bad, where she's once again on the meat station, where she makes mistake after mistake to the point where Ramsey kicks her out of the kitchen, which is obviously a bad look. And she is nominated for the 4th time this season, and is largely saved by the fact that Matt was there, who is an even worse chef than her. We get to the final 5, where she actually does pretty well there. She ends up winning Best of the Best, though even then she is unable to get out her target in Jen, where Bobby goes out instead. We then get to the final 4, where she makes a pretty notorious mistake of burning Ramsey's hand, not once, but twice. And while she does avoid nomination here, that's still a pretty bad look. We then get to the final 3 where she actually has a pretty bad service, making tons of mistakes while on the line, and even her leadership on the hot plate isn't that great either, to the point where she's nominated by both Corey and Petroza, and she somehow survives that round over Corey, which is pretty crazy there. And then we get to her final service, which admittedly is not that great either. Now, yes, she had Matt on her team, and obviously Matt ended up having a pretty bad service there, but I still feel like Petroza did enough to end up winning that season on paper, and I feel like the main reason Christina wins instead is because Petroza is much older than her, to where if Petroza had been a little bit younger, he probably wins that season instead. So again, it's not as if Christina played the worst game in the world, and there is some aspects of her game that makes you think that Ramsey would see her as a potential protege, but I feel like it was still a very messy game, where obviously she is nominated 5 times over the course of the season, and even at the points where she wasn't nominated, she still made plenty of dumb mistakes along the way, to where I would probably have her in the bottom tier of winners when I eventually do a Hell's Kitchen winner ranking. But again, she did win this season, and there were still enough impressive aspects to her game, like her winning Best of the Worst twice, to where I did decide to leave her here at number 3. Now moving on to number 2, and we have someone who played a slightly cleaner version of Christina's game, and that is Corey, the 3rd place finisher. And again, I feel like Corey played a cleaner game than Christina, though still not one that's overly dominant. Now admittedly, her first service is pretty bad, she ends up screwing up chicken, but I feel like her service 2 is pretty strong, where she ends up winning Best of the Worst due to her leadership skills, though she does follow it up with pretty questionable nominations, where she puts up Christina for strategic reasons, and Jen for personal reasons, and she fails to get either of them out, with Ramsey deciding to take out Sharon instead, and we even see in the following episode Christina and Jen being pretty mad at her for her wanting to target them. But despite Christina winning Best of the Worst in the following service, she isn't even nominated there, which I do find somewhat impressive, though to be fair, she doesn't really make any mistakes at that service to warrant a nomination either. We then get to service 4, where she does make a bit of a faux pas in naming herself as the strongest chef on her team, which her team is annoyed by, but again, she follows it up with a decent service there. And I feel like for the next couple services, she's able to do decently enough to avoid being targeted, not really making any major mistakes there, and she even manages to win another Best of the Worst in service 8. It's not until Black Jacket that she's really in danger again, where, again, the first Black Jacket service is pretty bad, where she largely has a bad attitude for a lot of it. She obviously burns her hand in the service as well, and she even refuses medical assistance initially, even though Ramsey is forcing her to, and she is nominated by Ramsey at this service, but similar to Christina, she really wasn't in danger of going home here, considering how much of an outlier Matt was. And while she does fine at the final 5 service, I think the final 4 service is pretty questionable, where while she has a decent start to that service, she ends up putting out an undercooked dish that the customer sends back, which is pretty bad, and that leads to her being nominated for the 2nd time of the season, but again, she's able to scrape through that. And then we get to the final 3, where while she does poorly on the hot plate, which highlights her poor leadership skills, I don't think she had the worst service there, where I feel like Christina was way worse on the line compared to her, and also was on the same level leadership-wise. So really it was a toss-up between Christina and Corey, and to be honest, I feel like Corey played a better game than Christina, where, again, despite her having mistakes along the way, she was in a lot less danger for a lot of the game compared to Christina, and I feel like she made fewer big mistakes than Christina, to where I probably would have picked Corey to go to Final 2 over Petroza. And while she had bad leadership at the Final 3 service, there were obviously points earlier in the season where she had good leadership, where she would take over for people's stations at points where they were struggling, and I feel like that was another impressive element to her game, to where I would have her above Christina on this player ranking, and a big reason she is here at number 2. And now, at number 1, the chef I believe performed the best on Hell's Kitchen Season 4, we have Petroza, the runner-up on the season. And again, if I were Chef Ramsey, and if I were basing this win based off who did better across the season, I would easily hand it over to Petroza, where I feel like Petroza was a much more consistent chef across the season than Christina or even Corey was. Now, yes, he does have a pretty rocky start to the season, where right off the bat, he has a really terrible signature dish, probably one of the worst we've seen up to this point in Hell's Kitchen history. And you also have service 2, where he almost quits the game after failing the quiz of reciting the menu, and then even after he comes back into the kitchen, he does pretty poorly on the meat station and mainly avoids nomination due to his team winning that service. But I do feel like after that, he does recover very well. Where in Service 3, he is able to win best of the worst. And I feel like for a lot of the season, he's able to avoid really big mistakes during services. You obviously have the moment in Service 5 where he manages to trick Scott into passing through an overcooked steak simply by slicing it, which I find pretty funny. Now he is nominated after Service 7, where he even volunteers for the block himself, which isn't great, but I feel like of the 3 nominees, he was the least likely to go home, where I feel like Ramsay was far more annoyed at Ben, and I feel like Lou Ross had a worse service than him, but still, he does volunteer for the block, which I don't love. But I feel like he rebounds pretty well, where he has a pretty good Service 8. Service 9, he manages to win best of the worst again, which is pretty good. And I feel like he's the most consistent competitor from the Black Jackets on, where he really doesn't have a single bad service there. And yes, while Ramsay chews him out for having a messy station, we never really see him making that big of a mistake. Outside the final 3, where admittedly he does pretty poorly there on the hot plate. He fails the quality control test, which is pretty bad, but at the same time, he somehow manages to avoid nomination there, skating his way to the final 2. And as I talked about with Christina, I feel like he did enough in the final service to warrant a win. Where while there were some hiccups with them running out of supplies and Jen not having the best service in the world, I feel like Petroza was by far the better chef throughout the season than Christina, and I feel like if I were Ramsay, I would have given the win to Petroza, and I feel like the main reason Petroza loses is, quite frankly, his age, where by that point he was nearing 50, and Ramsay didn't want someone that old to be manning a high-end restaurant like that. Whereas I feel like if Petroza were 10 or 20 years younger, he easily wins over Christina. So again, while Christina is the winner of the season, I feel like Petroza played a much cleaner game than her, where he ends up avoiding nomination for a lot of the season, where he's only nominated once, and I feel like he was enough of a leader during more points of the season to warrant a win over Christina, which is why I feel like he is the best chef from the season, and a big reason he is here at number 1. And there we go, that'll do it for this week's video. If you like this content, be sure to like and subscribe, really helps out with the channel. Now I'll be back again next week to continue these rankings, so you can look forward to that. And along with that, I'm making more general reality TV content during the Survivor off season. If you want to consider supporting the channel on Patreon, you can do so by clicking the link in the description. And you can also join the Discord server by also clicking the link in the description. There's a lot of stuff coming your way. But for now, that is the video. See ya.